Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for your patience. As you saw, we've got more than a capacity audience tonight. Not just lots of people, but obviously a very distinguished and erudite looking audience as well. So thank you very much indeed, all of you, for coming. And this will go down in the annals of the Society, I suppose, that it was Dr. Hunter who brought this crowd out. Our director, Simon Gilmer, can't be with us tonight, so I'm just going to read out the minutes of the last meeting myself. So it's the minutes of the meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland held at 6 p.m. in the auditorium NMS on Monday the 14th of March 2016. David Caldwell, President of the Society, in the chair. The minutes of the last meeting were read and approved. The following communication was read: Living and Dying at Aldhame, East Lothian, the excavation of an Anglican monastic settlement and medieval parish church by Dr. Anne Crone. And the same communication was read at 7:30 p.m. on Tuesday the 15th March in the Regent Building Lecture Theatre in Aberdeen. Jackson Armstrong in the chair. Can I sign these as a correct record of the meetings? Thank you very much. Well, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Fraser Hunter to give his talk on the Celts. Fraser is Principal Curator of the Iron Age and Roman collections at the National Museum. With a degree and PhD from Bradford University, he is one of the curatorial team who have created the Celts exhibition in Edinburgh and London. And I know Fraser of old. It was a pleasure to be one of his colleagues here over a number of years. And what I can also say is that Fraser is a very somebody with a very impressive knowledge and dedication, great breadth of knowledge on the Celts and other matters to do with the Iron Age. And I've had the opportunity, as I hope a number of you have as well, to look round the exhibition today and can say how very impressed I am with it. The way that the objects really speak, the way that you, without realising it, are drawn into looking at the objects, which I think is always very important in an exhibition of this type. At the end of the exhibition, there is a film where Fraser appears on television saying, "The Celts. It would be boring if we had an answer." Well, I don't know what Fraser is going to tell us about the Celts tonight, but one thing I am absolutely sure about is he is not going to be boring. So, Fraser.
Thank you, David. What a build-up. I'll have to live up to all that now. Well, thank you for the chance to come and speak to you this evening. It's a pleasure to have the chance to talk about what's been a baby very close to our hearts these last few years. Creating an exhibition is a massive thing to do, and it's fantastic to get the chance to talk about some of the ideas coming out of it. But this is not, if you like, the story of the show, because I'll be doing various other talks over the next few months for both the Antiquaries and for members of the museum, which is much more the introduction to the exhibition, pure and simple. What I want to look at tonight is rather some of the ideas behind the show. What were we trying to do? What do we now think we know about this complicated topic called Celts, seen particularly through the prism of things we call Celtic art? This is a big topic. I could spend the next 45 minutes on the 3rd century BC alone, but you'd be pleased to know I'm not going to do that. And if my co-curator Martin Goldberg was here, he would undoubtedly give you a different slant on this topic. But what I want to do is look really at 4 broad areas. I want to look at ways of thinking about the Celts. I want to look at ways of seeing Celtic art. How do we try to read and understand this material today? I want to look particularly at different Celtic arts, the ways in which the objects that you see on the screen can be the building blocks of European history. And finally, I want to look at ways of presenting, some of the practicalities in terms of how we've tried to put the show together. The focus all the way through is objects. The focus, if you like, is Celtic art, and yet this is not an art show. These are not pretty things to hang on a wall. These are powerful, connected objects, things that had a purpose and a meaning. The decoration was a key part of their role. And they lead us into big ideas and big questions about Europe's past. So yes, they're technically amazing, they're incredibly impressive, but they tell us stories. And it's these stories that I want to lead us into tonight. And the big story, I guess, is the question of the Celts. What do we mean by this topic? One of the things that motivated us was that despite the last generation or so of scholarship, there's still a very traditional view in much of the popular press and popular literature about what Celts are all about. Marauding hordes, wandering their way across Europe, stravaigling from battle to battle. If I was being unkind, I would call this the BBC view of the Celts, given recent programmes. And so we always get the question, where did the Celts come from? In a sense, this is a non-question, because the last 20, 30 years of scholarship has destroyed this kind of maps with arrows approach to the world. There is no one people, there is no one culture, no one group called the Celts. A whole series of different ideas and concepts come together, of people being called Celts by others, or people calling themselves Celts. One word does not fit them all. So most of the rest of this talk is going to be spent explaining why one word doesn't fit it, and some of the more uninteresting ways we can look at it instead. Now, much of this revisionist view of the Celts was driven by UK archaeologists. And there's been a lot of work over the last 20 or so years questioning the idea of the Celts, particularly in relation to Britain. And much of this was driven by a fairly simple observation. That the basic source of much of our knowledge is the classical authors, the Greek and Roman authors. And this map here, based on some of John Collis's work, shows the areas where Celts are mentioned by the classical sources. And you see top left one of these Greek visions of a Celt. Barbarians have to be naked and defeated, you understand. This is perhaps the modern view of Celts, or where at least Celtic languages survive today, and you'll see the complete mismatch between these two sources of evidence. Now, is this just semantics? Is this just because our evidence is partial? Well, the archaeologists would argue no, because there are fundamental differences between different parts of Europe. During the Iron Age, about 2,000, 2,500 years ago, which is really what we're looking at today. And those fundamental differences make it very hard to bundle them all under the one word. So, for example, the kind of houses people live in. In Britain, almost entirely round. On the continent, almost entirely rectangular. This is a fairly fundamental thing about the way you're living your life, your everyday experience. And other things are very, very different across the continent. How you treat your dead. Do you bury them at all? Do you bury them with rich grave goods? Do you burn them, or do you bury them in the ground? So much of the narrative of Celts in the archaeological literature is driven by rich burials, like this one from the Glauberg near Frankfurt, a wonderfully rich burial full of bits of Celtic art. People simply don't do that in other parts of Europe. And this, we think, represents fundamentally different societies and must imply different ways of thinking, different soul beliefs, different concepts of the afterlife. Very hard to bundle these all together under a single label, Celts. So, for many British archaeologists, the Celts have been abandoned, written out of history. But this too is a mistake, because there are connections across Europe in the Iron Age and the early medieval period, and we ignore these at our peril. These too are a key part of the story. And the two main linkages are art and language. So I take here a style of decorated sword. These are sword scabbards found from the Thames to the Black Sea. a shared warrior ideology at this time with paired beasts, most likely protective creatures at the mouth of the scabbard. So we may wish to see things differently in Britain, but other things tie us into this wider world. And likewise, language. This is taking ancient place names with Celtic language elements in them and showing very strongly connections across Europe, much of this evidence being Iron Age in date. So there are these links which we need to try to understand as well. And this is where the problem is. We tend to bundle all different kinds of evidence together when we're thinking and talking about Celts, and yet they're all telling us about slightly different things. The classical sources give us one view, one partial view from their Mediterranean foothold. Looking out beyond their pond over the Alps, they get only a partial picture of worlds they're not really seeing. The languages give us another view, stretching at various periods over large parts of Europe, but not necessarily implying a shared culture or a shared people. The art styles give us another view, but there are different kinds of Celtic art in different times and places. So again, difficult to bundle this all under the one label. And then archaeologists come along, dig holes and mess everything up with another set of evidence. Often much more the everyday, the houses, the settlements, the farming and so on. So we have these and other strands of evidence. And the danger in the past, the temptation has been to draw a big circle around the whole lot and call everything Celtic. And this is way, way too simple. People don't have one single idea of who they are. We can't take one idea and say this defines a person. There's a huge variation in time and space across this area. Things will have varied. Things will have changed. One name cannot encompass everything happening in Europe over 2,500 years. And it comes down to ideas of identity. No one thing defines a person. It's not just language. It's not just where you're born. There's lots of different strands, varying in time and place, varying according to who you're speaking to or who's looking at you. There is no single thing that defines a Celt. It's far more complicated and as a result, far more interesting. So, we're going on a complicated roller coaster. Hold on to your seats. And one of the problems with much of this, what I would say is a simplistic view of Celts, comes right back from the first observers, the Greeks and the Romans. Because they too are staring into a world they don't entirely understand. Their encounters with the areas to the north of them are often military or trade focused, and it's given them a very partial view. They tend to look down on their neighbours. They tend to stereotype them as barbarians, people very different from them. As a result, we get these stereotypical pictures like the ones I show before you. And these pictures condition what we think as well. Now, it's not that they're totally wrong, but they are partial. So, for example, in the classical sources, Celts always wear torques. Now, yes, you will see in the exhibition a lot of torques, but lots of folk wear torques. Torques are widespread in the European Bronze Age and Iron Age. Here are examples from France, from Germany, and top right from Denmark. So it's not that the Greek and Roman authors should be discarded, but they're giving us a partial view, and we need to look at other sources to balance that out. But the Greeks and the Romans have been very influential. Because with the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, these classical sources came alive again. Suddenly they survived for scholars to look at. They could be circulated. Works like Julius Caesar's Conquest of Gaul became available on every scholar's bookshelf. Well, Caesar talks about Celts. This is a 16th century version of Caesar where I've highlighted the 16th century cartographer's view of where the Celts would be. And these little snapshots and hints in the classical sources were grabbed on by scholars of the 16th and 17th centuries as ways to understand a world they didn't know. How do you fill up prehistory? How do you understand your past? Well, these little glimpses from books like Caesar became key. And so scholars like George Buchanan, artists like John White, used the classical sources and other little bits and pieces of evidence they could gather together to start to paint a picture of the past and called it Celtic. Then, from the early 18th century, the language links were finally recognised and given the name Celtic, based largely on Caesar, drawing on the evidence from Caesar for the name. And these two got added into the mix, along with any piece of archaeological evidence people could find. Everything had to be either Celtic, Roman, or Danish. Those were the only words around to understand your past. So here, the great Neolithic henge at Avebury in Wiltshire is called by the antiquary William Stukeley a Celtic temple. And this really is where much of our problems come from. Anything gets called Celtic. And us museum types don't really help the issue, because as objects start getting discovered and recognised, they too get labelled as Celtic. And two of the formative collections are the two that have come together to build this exhibition. The British Museum and the National Museum, as our predecessors were trying to understand these objects. They spotted similarities and connections, and they seized on the term Celt to explain them. So Daniel Wilson here in Edinburgh, Augustus Franks in the British Museum, were seeing new finds brought to light by the Industrial Revolution, by the dredging of canals and the building of railways. And these new finds needed to be understood, and Celts gave a label. So they saw connections and links, they recognized the styles of art, but they again bundled together lots of different things. On the left, a 15th century casket, on the right, a 3rd century BC shield boss, all given the name Celtic. And this is one of our problems. It's too small a word for too big a concept. There's way, way more going on here. So one of my tasks tonight is to begin to tease this argument apart and separate the different styles of Celtic art and let them tell their own stories. But there's another motive, and it's to try to rehabilitate some of our British evidence, some of our Scottish evidence, into this wider picture. Not only have British archaeologists largely ignored the continent for the Iron Age, continental archaeologists have seen this argument and thought, oh, leave them to it, let them go and squabble. So when we loan objects to other exhibitions, these are two big Celtic art exhibitions in recent years, there's been a little British room where the British stuff is put off to one side. You know, it's interesting, but it's not quite the same. And this also is wrong, because our stuff needs to be seen in a European context for it to make sense. So another of my strands tonight is to weave our material into this much bigger story, this European scale story. And to understand it, we need to recalibrate our eyes. We need to look at different ways of seeing. Because the ways in which Celtic art was constructed, the people making it and using it saw the world in different ways, depicted the world in different ways from how we do. We still are steeped in the well of classicism. We are used to things looking like things. Good art is representational. Now, this has become less true over the course of the 20th century, but we're still heavily influenced by neoclassicism. People ought to look like people. Horses ought to look like horses. This was not the case in the Iron Age. Here are two Iron Age coins, and above them the Greek prototype. And you can see how different they are. Now, this is not just bad copying. These were skilled craft workers. There's a reason this horse is given a human head. There's a reason the head of Apollo is given this really rather natty hairstyle. Because it didn't matter that things weren't realistic. That wasn't important. That wasn't what you were trying to show. Things don't need to look real to tell you something. And we can see that again and again in the material we have on display here. You need to stare into this complex world where nothing is quite what it seems, where there can be a hint or a suggestion of a person or an animal. Nothing is ever straightforward. So it's giving us a very different way of looking at the world. And as an example, look at this shield boss from the River Thames at Wandsworth from the British Museum collection. And you look at it to begin with and you think, oh, it's a lovely, pretty pattern. And then perhaps you begin to see, oh, that looks a bit like a tendril of vegetation. And then perhaps you see the eye and the hooked beak of a bird. And at that point, perhaps this tendril transforms into a wing. And then you look more closely, and inside the wing is another bird, engraved inside this wing. Or is it a wing? Maybe it's just a leaf. And there's always this uncertainty, this shadow puppetry in trying to understand this material. It's deliberately difficult. It's not meant to be easy. It's representing this different way of seeing the world. You had to know to understand. And that was deliberately exclusive. And this idea of different ways of seeing the world can be seen in this belt hook from near Trier as well. A head and two bizarre creatures either side. But are they two creatures? Or is it the one creature opened out? Is this a way of showing you both sides of the one creature simultaneously? And Laurent Olivier has argued this is representing a way of depicting something as you imagine it rather than as you see it. And below it, in the coral patterning here, Felix Müller has suggested this is not just abstract, that the two dots represent the two heads, the two slashes, the two wings. Who knows? Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. Maybe it was if you thought it was there. So it's taking us on steps on a difficult journey where we need to set our eyes differently to understand this material. Nothing here is straightforward. Realism is contorted and turned and twisted. But this is not just a Celtic thing. One can get very mystically mumbo-jumbo-y about the magic, transformational power of the Celts. Except if you look at the anthropological, non-Western art, you find exactly the same kind of thing again and again. And I've picked 3 examples largely at random here from our and the BM collections to give a sense of how representation is not everything. In all of these, you can see hints of plants and animals. And this anthropological work has been really powerful in trying to understand what Celtic art means, or may mean. Because with this, you can talk to the folk who made it, something we can never do with our material. And they can tell you about some of the ideas behind it. Ideas that there will be stories and myths and beliefs lurking in these objects. Ideas that there will be a powerful and protective element to them, perhaps. The deliberately twisting and contorting designs to trap demons and bad spirits. Arguing that they will be used to impress, even to enchant the onlooker, to make them think, wow, this is somebody powerful, somebody important, somebody connected. And we can turn some of those ideas to Celtic art, or the various Celtic arts. Because one striking thing about our material is it's almost always on high value stuff, gold, occasionally silver and bronze. The more everyday decoration which you see to the left on bone, on pottery, on glass, doesn't generally have this complicated swirling patterns. This is not an art of the everyday. So for me, this decoration, this patterning implies that there is something special, something limited about this. Not everyone would understand Celtic art. There are some exceptions. I'll come to them as we go through it. But in general, this was an art for people who knew. It implies you're showing off your power, your connections, by owning and having this kind of material. So some folk are deliberately signalling their links into this much wider international world. These are also not just decoration. These are not art objects you hang on a wall. They are powerful, important objects. They do things. They influence people. Objects always influence what we do, whether we think about it or not. Your enjoyment of my talk this evening will partly depend on my words. It also depends on the comfort of the seat you're sitting in. An uncomfortable seat makes a talk far less pleasant. Objects shape what we do. So much more so with these objects here. They are deliberately trying to influence, impress, and tell stories. So remember, these are the actors and the agents in our story, not just the props in the backdrop. So what can we say about this material? Well, there is no one story behind it. And a key point of the exhibition is we've tried to tease apart the idea of a single Celtic art. There is no single Celtic art, no golden evolutionary thread running through all this stuff. We look at 4 blocks, and it's those blocks I'd like to introduce you to this evening. We look at the Iron Age, between about 450-500 BC and about 200 BC, and we look in particular at a connected Europe. We look at the impact of the Roman world increasing from the 2nd century BC onwards and running through to the 2nd century AD. We look at the development of Christianity and a new set of influences around the middle of the 1st millennium AD. And then we look at the rediscovery and revival of the idea of Celts, something I've touched on already. So I'd like to focus really on these blocks here for a little while and see what stories the objects can tell you. Because these objects are impacting on big pictures in European history, tying into times of contacts, connections, and change. And often it's contacts between the Mediterranean world and the lands to their north. So our first case study is looking at this time towards the middle of the 1st millennium BC. A world before Rome. A world when we're looking at the Greek colonies in the western Mediterranean, when the Etruscans are building towns and doing all kinds of interesting stuff in the north of Italy. And a time when there's been links across the Alps for a couple of 100 years already into eastern France, southern Germany. But a key thing happens in the 5th century. There's a major shift of power, connections, and importance north of the pre-existing links. We see this in objects. We can't yet tease it out in detail, but we see these connections in objects. We see it in finds like this. The flagon from Bas-Yutz, now in the British Museum, found in northeastern France, in Lorraine, made probably around 350 BC, a masterpiece of these early styles of Celtic art. An almost entirely impractical wine flagon. It would fall over if you tried to fill it with anything, but it looks amazing. On the base of the handle, this stylized figure, a face that isn't really a face, with an exaggerated moustache and eyebrows, with leaves growing out of the top of his head. On the spout, a duck swimming down a river of wine. And this vessel gives us the connections we need to understand something of what's happening in this world. Because this vessel shows connections. The idea of the bronze vessel comes from the classical world, this one from Etruscan prototypes. The wee bird and other aspects of the decoration are taken from local beliefs. I show you a detail of a bucket here with similar water birds swimming their way along the rim of it, tied in most likely to ideas of birds that will carry the sun on its daily journey. And the idea of fierce animals doesn't take us south to the Mediterranean, but east to the steppe of Russia and beyond, where you find styles like this in Scythian art stretching all the way to the boundaries of China. So this is a connected world. And it's this connections, these linkages that seem to form one of the sparks to create this new style of art in a world that is changing fast. And one of these changes we suspect is in the matter of beliefs. The beliefs are now impossible to reconstruct. But much art is tied up in the service of belief. And when you see a figure like this, the well over life-size stone statue from Holzgerlingen in southwestern Germany, two-faced, leaves growing out of his head, this speaks of the supernatural. This is not a portrait of your grandfather. This is something a bit special. Likewise, on the other end of the scale, the tiny little brooches here, they are rather misleading when blown up. The top one is barely 50 millimeters long. But contorted into that little masterpiece of bronze casting are 10 separate creatures, some human, some animal, some bird-like, some fish-headed, contorted and twisted together. And these speak to us surely of myths and stories and beliefs, and a changing set of myths and stories and beliefs at this time in the 5th century. Now, the reasons behind that remain unclear. It's an idea that was put out by Ludwig Pauli in the 70s. It still seems plausible, but it's hard to explain. But somehow, beliefs are changing at this time. Beliefs are an element of this, but as I've said already, beliefs tie into ideas of connections and status. So these may not be the beliefs of everybody, they may be the beliefs of a few. And when we look at some of the burials, for burials are our best evidence, we see traces of a well-connected elite. Look at this burial from Saint-Bion in northeastern France, where we have imported pottery from Greece and from northern Italy. We have a warrior's equipment, feasting gear, and also these wonderful decorated bronze fittings from a chariot. So these objects show connections. These show skill and knowledge, for to make these things requires a remarkable amount of skill. This is the high-risk moment in the presentation, because I am hoping, if I press a button... no, let's try again. Here we go. This worked in rehearsals in my room, but didn't work in rehearsals here. What we're showing here is the way the design is constructed, the skill of the metalworker, but also the knowledge, laying out all these different circles, circle upon circle, line upon line, in order to get the positions for the cutouts which you need to make the decoration. This requires complicated applied mathematics. You have to understand things like Pythagoras' theorem to be able to lay out something like this. So having an object like this, owning an object like this, people would have known this was something special. Is the last bit going to go? Oh, it's stalled. If you imagine, let's nip back one. So that gets you to this. All these cutouts are lying on the arcs of these circles. You need all those circles to make that pattern. This is a remarkable piece of craft work. And people would know when they saw it, this was something special. So, this stuff is important. But these early stages are not really a story that involves us. I've been trying desperately to tug the bits of this story into Britain, and it's really quite difficult at this very early period. Mostly it is happening in eastern France, southern Germany, and over into the Danube. But these styles become popular, they spread and they develop. The connections and the links matter. And so by the 3rd century BC, which you see on the right here, these styles of Celtic art spread over most of Europe. Interestingly, far beyond areas where Celtic languages are used. The two do not tie together. So if we look at this particular style of art, this wonderful three-dimensional style of art, it's found from the Black Sea to Ireland. And I've shown one of the rare Scottish examples, top left, a brooch from Ballaghill in Kintyre, which fits into this wider world of connections and linkages. And often lurking in these scrolls are hidden creatures. The face on the chariot fitting here, the mournful looking horse on this chariot fitting here. Again, it's art that is worth staring at. Objects, people, animals come out at you the more you look. A hint or a twist of a beast or a creature. And this brings us right back to Scotland. Because this is the point where we start seeing people in Britain not just tying into this network occasionally, but making some of these objects themselves. We start to see distinctively British and Irish styles of ornament. This is a Tor's pony cap, one of the treasures of the National Collection, and one of the best examples of this style. The scrolling decoration here is based on the kind of thing we saw in the previous slide. The engraved decoration here is also from continental styles. Here are some examples from Britain, from Ireland, and from a particularly close example from France, with this beast staring out at you. So here we see people in Britain making things in this international style, but making it in a distinctively British way. A Europe of the regions is emerging, if you like, showing your connections. Now, there's been a long debate over how exactly this thing was used. And these are two of Stuart Piggott's very evocative pictures, arguing that it was most unlikely to be a cap. That's a very unhappy-looking horse there. And much more likely to be a cap like this. The debate, though, has been over these things. Stuart Piggott, formerly Abercrombie professor here, was deeply scathing of the idea that these were attached to the cap in antiquity. He argued they were added on by an enterprising Galloway tinker in the 19th century to increase their market value. Now, being a Gallovidian myself, I've always been personally hurt by this. So it's a pleasure to be able to rehabilitate my distant ancestors. Thanks to two things. Thanks to the manuscript of Joseph Train, the antiquarian, who was a fixer for Sir Walter Scott. For this piece came into Scott's collection. And this was one of the grounds for suspicion, because Scott was not averse to a little bit of creative fiddling in order to make things look better. But the real smoking gun has been some wonderful work by Stephen Briggs, trawling through old newspaper accounts. I suspect the Caledonian Mercury is not on many of your reading lists, but it is on Stephen's reading list. Dumfries, December the 8th, 1812. A very curious relic of antiquity was lately found covered about 4 feet deep in a moss in the neighbourhood of Castle Douglas, which till about 20 years ago formed part of the bottom of a lake. It is formed out of a thin plate of brass and in shape resembles a mask for the human face, being about 10 inches long and 4 inches deep. There are 2 crooked horns which project from between the circular openings. So the very first record we have, the horns are attached. Gallovidians 1, Walter Scott's 0. Thank you very much. This makes it actually even more spectacular. We have other evidence of horses wearing hats. This is a coin from the southeast of England showing, in this case, a winged horse, a Pegasus, with exactly such a hat on his or her head. And this fits into a wider idea of dressing up the horses. How you travel was a way of showing off. So having a flashy chariot and a well-dressed horse was a really important aspect of being somebody important. That plus the fact that you're signalling your international connections in an object like this. The tantalizing thing, of course, is the account in the Caledonian Mercury goes on to describe what is clearly the rest of the horse harness, now missing. So perhaps my Gallovidian ancestors weren't quite so good at this after all. But I do think on a mantelpiece somewhere near Castle Douglas, there must be more bits of this hoard lying around somewhere. It's one of our plans for the summer, is to go on an antiques roadshow in Castle Douglas. So Tor's gives us this idea of local versions of international styles. And that's something we can see in other iconic Scottish objects. This is the head of a carnix from Deskford in Murray. A carnix is an animal-headed horn, and you can see on the Gundestrup cauldron here how this would originally have looked. This is a Scottish version of an international style. So in the exhibition we have a French version, recognisably the same thing, but this one done with a Gallic flair rather than with Presbyterian simplicity. So different versions, but same idea, local and international. And that for me is a much better way of understanding things than trying to argue for a single concept of Celts. I said this is useful art. And that's made really clear if we take an example. And let's take the example of a burial from Valdalgisheim to the west of Bonn, of what probably a powerful woman buried around 320 BC. This antiquarian image doesn't really give you a sense of the quality of the material. My slides don't either, but they give you a sense of what you'll see when you go next door. And what's interesting from our point of view is what the mourners chose to bury this woman with, because they marked out the areas of life that were important. The jewellery that you would use to show off and to mark your connections. And this jewellery is decorated with trailing patterns of vegetation wriggling over the terminals. Feasting equipment, a flagon and a bucket for serving wine. And this too is engraved with wonderful patterns, with a slightly sad-looking horse at the top, and at the bottom, this amazing figure of an old bearded man, again with leaves coming out of his head, a mark of some kind of special or supernatural status, and again with the eye of faith, beasts biting either side of the handle. Again, you have to look. Nothing is quite what it seems here. So she's buried to look impressive. She's buried to be able to cater for a feast or to have food for the afterlife. And she's buried with the fittings of a chariot for travel on the last journey. And on this chariot is a whole range of highly decorated metalwork, most fascinating of which for me is a pair of bronze mounts showing a woman. Showing a woman with an amazing headdress or one of these leaf crowns. And her body is covered in vegetation, in this scrolling pattern of vegetation. This is the reconstruction with the coral inlays put back into it. Is this a god? Is this the woman herself, transforming from human into divine or vice versa? Again, it hints at the stories and the beliefs lurking behind this material, probably commissioned specially for this woman's burial. So this is useful art, showing connections, showing status, taking you to the afterlife. Jewellery, feasting, transport, and the thing not represented in this burial is warfare. That's the other big area where decoration is lavished on material. And much of this is not weaponry for fighting with, it's weaponry for showing off with, for posturing and pouncing about. The champion, the battle of champions, if you like, rather than the massed ranks. So I hope I've shown this stuff is powerful, this stuff is connected, this stuff is useful. But it's more than just Celtic. And one of the things I'm most pleased we managed to get for the exhibition is this incredible cauldron from Denmark, from Jutland. Again, I could speak to you for the next hour and a half on this cauldron. I won't, but I could. That's the threat if you're bad in questions. I'll come back on you about Gundestrup cauldron. It's an incredible thing, and it features in almost every popular book on the Celts, and yet it isn't Celtic. Or at least it's not just Celtic. It takes us into this wider world. The depictions on this cauldron include objects that we see elsewhere in the exhibition. Things like torques, but if we hop back a slide, torques around the necks of these beings that must be deities. Or this image here on the inside of the cauldron where we have the Carnix players who we met before. A largely Western and Central European idea, Celtic if you wish. And yet the style of metalwork is typical of southeastern Europe. This is made in the Danube area. And the images take us further. A god sitting in a yoga pose. A pair of elephants. Not really the kind of thing you normally see wandering around temperate Europe. And the world of Gundestrup takes us far beyond any simple idea of Celts. Made in the southeast of Europe. Drawing in influences from the west, from the east, as far as India, and ultimately buried in a bog in Denmark. Now we can write all kinds of historical fiction about what might have happened. What's important is that this did happen, that you have these connections and these links all across Europe, far beyond anything we call Celtic. This is an interlinked world, at least for some people in it. So Celts is too small a word to embrace this kind of idea. Worlds change, and objects and art changes with them. And our second big topic looks at the increasing influence of the Roman world from 200 BC onwards. Now, this is not just driven by the expansionist power of Rome. There are also local changes, societies coming together, towns developing, trade developing. But one of the big changes you see is the decline of the really spectacular art that I've been showing you. And instead, rather than these highly individual creations, what you get are much more smaller scale, mass-produced objects. Things like coins are still impressive, are still miniature works of art, but now they're made in their tens of thousands, now rather than being made in a single object. So they've got a different function. More people will see these than would see something like Gundestrup or would see a gold torque. Influence is stretching, but probably more people are being influenced by it. And we see changes in the styles as well. Rather than the absolutely abstract hints of creatures we saw in the earlier fashions, what we now see is modified realism. People looking at classical art and thinking, yeah, I suppose a cow does look a bit like that, but I'm going to give my cow a squint. Or I'm going to give my horse, I don't need to depict a horse properly. I can catch a horse in a pair of curves. Or I can evoke a deer with the flowing line of a paintbrush, but it isn't really a deer, with its massive ears and its stylized, almost a Walt Disney expression. Again, it's not quite realistic. There's a twist and a modification. They're not just copying things from the classical world. Everything is twisted to the local way of seeing things. But here, our story starts to split. Because up until now, Britain and the rest of Europe have been tied quite closely together. From here on, Britain and to a degree Ireland are doing things a bit differently. Because these more abstract, more individual, more complicated styles persist in Britain when they vanish in the continent. I say in Britain. In fact, that's only partly true. We have almost none of them. Mostly, this is a Southern and Eastern English style. So you get these amazing things like these incredible engraved mirrors, which are mostly found south of the Wash-Severn line. This makes what happens next all the more interesting, because most of the centre and north of Britain goes from having none of this Celtic art to an explosion of this material. This is work by Duncan Garrow and Chris Gosden, looking at approximately the rate at which objects are buried in the ground. And you see small amounts in the late 1st century BC, early 1st century AD, and then an explosion after the red dotted line. The red dotted line is the evil Romans turning up. So one of the unexpected impacts of the Roman conquest of Britain, or of part of Britain, is this explosion of Celtic art over most of the country. Really everywhere apart from the Atlantic edges of Scotland is seeing material at this date. This is connected to a society under threat. Societies that need to make big, bold gestures, make big, grand objects to show off with. Things like swords and helmets and these kind of things. Classic warrior apparatus to fight off the Romans. And yet it ain't so simple. The sword has got the helmet has a Roman inscription on the side of it. The decoration is mirrored on the handle of a Roman helmet. This is most likely made for a friend of Rome, not an enemy. The sword here from South Cave in the East Riding, wonderful recent discovery of Celtic art, swirling decoration, but again, no mere art of resistance. The hilt includes elephant ivory, imported from the Roman world. So this is no simple world of black and white, of enemy and friend, of Roman and anti-Roman. There's a complicated set of shades of grey as folk adapt to this new world, this new reality. And the objects are part of that, coming to terms with this new Roman world. And we see that very widely in Roman Britain and beyond, in things like brooches, which bring together Roman and Iron Age styles. Things like these wonderful curling dragonesque brooches, or this recent find from Aldern, far north of the Roman frontier, a massive brooch, fully 6 inches long, loaded with every kind of northern Celtic art you can imagine, and yet based on a Roman brooch. These are ways of folk dealing with a changed world, trying to come to terms with a Roman and a local identity, bringing these worlds together, and objects are the way they do it, flagging something about these changes. About hybrids, about worlds that are linking and creating something new. This is a tiny little bronze pan, which is a souvenir, tourist tat from Hadrian's Wall. The inscription says, on the line of the wall, and it then lists the forts of Hadrian's Wall. This is what Latin scholars get terribly excited by, this kind of stuff. The really interesting bit is the design down below, because these swirls and spirals are taken straight from the pattern books of Celtic art. But are they? Because you look at it one way and you see the triple-legged spirals, you look at it another way and you start to see the curving leaf buds and leaves of a classical vine scroll pattern. So here we see these two worlds brought together, and what you saw in it would depend on what you wanted to see. You can see Celtic art, you can see classical art. It all depends who you are. Now normally, conventionally, people would break the story at this point. And you would see the emergence of what I cruelly term gift shop art, the kind of stuff you can buy in gift shops up and down the Royal Mile, the later, I suppose, early medieval styles of Celtic art, which we know from the great illuminated manuscripts. And these are often seen as surviving somehow beyond the reach of the evil Roman world and booming again as the iron hand of Rome is lifted off. This is nonsense. These styles come out of a Roman world. These scrolls and spirals grow in the provinces of the Roman Empire, particularly among the army. We can find examples like this from Britain to Germany to Syria. Styles that become popular and grow in this crucible, this melting pot of the Roman frontier, and emerge out of a Roman world. The styles and also the materials. Because now we start seeing silver being used in local art styles much more. Silver that is made from remelted Roman silver plate, like the Trapraean treasure. So there are Roman roots to this new style of Celtic art. It's not just this mystical survival on the edge of the world. The key thing in our story now, or the next key stage, is another legacy of Rome, which is Christianity. And often people talk about Celtic Christianity and pull up things like illuminated manuscripts and the great ringed crosses like these. And yet we are no fringe on the edge of Europe here. These are created as part of the conversion process of Europe into Christianity. We are one of many versions of people adapting to this newly Christian world. And what we see, again, is contacts, connections, and change. This new world, again, adapting to this new world, what you do is bring things together and fuse them into a new style. This is the Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the great pattern books, the great gospel books of the early medieval period, which has got these swirling spirals coming out of an Iron Age and Roman world. But it's also got patterns from a classical world. The borders around the edges or the interlace are the kind of things you find on Roman mosaics. So classical influences, and also influences from the Germanic, the Anglo-Saxon world. These interlacing, biting beasts come from a different world entirely, fused together into this thing that we simplify as Celtic art, but is actually, again, this melting pot, this new form in this newly Christian world. So when we look at some of the great treasures of our own collection, like the Hunterston brooch, on the back of it, the spirals that are coming out of an older tradition. On the front of it, the interlace coming from a Germanic, from an Anglo-Saxon tradition. Look at the zoom into the beast on the pinhead, and you could drop this Anglo-Saxon buckle from Faversham in Kent into that design and not notice the difference. Connections, contact, and again, belief and status. The ideas are the same, but the way it's being done is subtly different every time. So this is one of the high points, the last of our fusions, if you like. From here on, to my eyes, our story rather changes. Because you see older objects being enshrined and venerated. Here we see the Catholic of St. Columba, which was enshrined within this book shrine. Most of the cover you see here is high Gothic in nature, losing the swirls and scrolls and spirals of earlier traditions. Or looking at decoration like these coming out of the Scottish medieval tradition, where you're either tying into much wider European patterns, versions of the European Romanesque, you can argue, or looking back to the relatively recent past. So the interlace of this medieval object is drawing on shallow rather than deep roots. No Celtic continuity here, but drawing on the stones they can see in their own landscape. So our story is one of different Celtic arts. How have we gone about telling it? How do you present the Celts? Well, we have been incredibly lucky to have a mix of two institutions with two of the great art collections and archaeological connections with the British Museum and the National Museum. And also a great team. Colleagues in London, initially Jodie Joy and Ian Lyons, subsequently Julia Farley and Rosie Weech. Martin as the co-curator here, and also Heather Pulliam and Francis Fowle from the university, helping us in particular with the medieval and post-medieval story. But this is not the same exhibition. We are not a cut-down version of London. The two organisations, the curatorial team, developed some ideas, and each team then applied it to their own space. And in fact, there are three versions of the story. One in London, one in Edinburgh, and one in a book, available at all good bookshops at very, very reasonable rates. But this gives us a third bite at the cherry. This is not just a catalogue. This is another version of the story, doing things in a book we can't do in an exhibition. So the two shows share and also differ. London is a much bigger space than we have. This gives you an early concept diagram, which from their show, where they had this swirling overhead banner above your head, because their space is vast, 6 meters tall, big enough that you could fit in casts of some of the high crosses that simply would not fit in our show unless you lay them flat on the ground. So there are some differences for practical reasons. The core of the shows are similar, but there are things that we changed. So the London show at the beginning and the end focused particularly on British identity, or British and Irish identity. So it opened with a series of icons of modern identity, the harp and a Eisteddfod banner and a ringed cross, and it finished with a consideration of the modern Celt, if you like. We didn't do that. We shared the core, the Iron Age, the Roman, the early medieval, but our beginning and end are rather different. Our beginning takes a broader canvas and talks much more about a European space and time, and tries to pose this fundamental mismatch between the Greek and Roman views, the Celtic revival view, and the many past realities. And our ending tries to look at the Celtic revival and then come back to some of these topics of what do Celts mean today. Now, we don't try to do the really modern stuff, though. Archaeologists are poorly equipped, I feel, to deal with complicated issues like that. Leave us in the past and the implications of the past and where the ideas come from. To look at modern identity is another exhibition entirely. Very interesting one, but we'll give you the building blocks for you to go and think about. So we've changed various bits and pieces. We've added in some things. So we've got, for example, our reconstruction chariot from the excavations at Newbridge in Edinburgh. This is the reconstruction. The original is much rustier, I'm afraid. This is its first public outing, and this is an image of the oldest chariot in Britain and Ireland, and a real piece of high technology, a fantastic item. We've also not just dipped into our own collections, but deliberately borrowed additional material where we felt it filled a gap. So we are not just cutting down to fit our space, we are also adding in to fit our story. We wanted more stuff from Eastern Europe to emphasize the spread of this material. So these amazing figures from Mezek in Bulgaria have joined the show. We didn't just want to tell people Gundstrup was made in Thrace, we wanted to show the argument. So we've borrowed a Romanian hoard of Thracian silver, now in Vienna, which offers the best parallel to the decoration on the Gundstrup cauldron. The first time these have ever been seen together. So you can see why we make this argument. We borrowed from Bern in Switzerland, including one of their iconic items, this amazing bear statuette, which takes the Roman story beyond just Britain. For this is a statuette of the Roman period, but it's embodying a local goddess, Dea Artio, the bear goddess, here depicted most likely both in human form and as rather hungry bear form. It is the cutest animal on display, without a shadow of a doubt. But it again helps to put our story into a broader context. We also reshaped the ending, looking a bit at the Celtic revival and the way in which the rediscovered art inspired modern artists and indeed politicians, but in particular trying to use it to pose some of our fundamental questions again. And the vehicle we used for this was this print here by the Dundee artist John Duncan, Anima Celtica, Celtic soul or Celtic mind. And this is very much part of the Celtic revival and trying to generate and encourage pride in all things Celtic. And so you see the Celtic muse with figures from Gaelic myths round about her, the blind bard Ossian. One can debate how far he's invented in the 18th century. But very much part of this idea of bringing together different stories from a supposedly timeless Celtic past, and then adorned with all manner of jewellery. Jewellery which my colleague Dr. Goldberg spotted had been lifted from this museum's catalogue. 1892, the catalogue of the National Museum of Antiquities includes every single object which has been depicted on that picture. So Duncan is flicking his way through the catalogue and picking things that look to him Celtic. So we can reassemble those objects. Objects covering 2,500 years of Scottish history. And this, I think, is the fundamental difference in approach. To some people like Duncan, Celts are traditional and timeless. To me, they're not. These are different stories. They cannot be held under the single word Celtic. There is so much more to it than that. We should not be lumping all these things under the one label. So it's not one people, not one race, not one story. People have been talking about Celts for 2,500 years now, and I do wonder if we're any closer to understanding them. And part of the problem is that we keep trying to shoehorn our complicated data into single, simple labels. We need to stop this. Our objects, our information tells us far more exciting stories about contacts and change, about powerful objects, the way in which decoration can give us insights into the big pictures of European history, of how we in Scotland are part of this bigger world, and it's not an unchanging world. Our role in it comes and goes, ebbs and flows, but the objects are the actors that help us to tell that story. I hope I've given you some sense of that story tonight, but I can just give you words. You need to go and see the objects. And you need to go repeatedly because our visitor targets are very ambitious. So, visit early, visit often. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Fraser. That applause and its warmth and length, I think, says everything about your talk. Do we have any questions or comments for Fraser? We've got a couple of microphones going around, so can you wait until somebody gives you a microphone so we can all hear what you've got to say?
Thanks very much, Dr. Hunter. I've been fortunate enough to see the exhibition in both places, and I do agree that I think there's something about the design and the content and the variation here, which is much better than the show in the British Museum. A question specifically about the Gundstrup cauldron. If you just care to make a couple of comments about its life and function.
I did warn you I could go on about Gundstrup for a long time. I will try very hard not to. It is one of the most contested and argued about objects in European prehistory. The scale, you'll see it next door, the scale is massive. It's about 2.5, 3 feet in diameter. And there's been an enormous debate about how exactly it would have functioned, where it would have been made, how it would have been used. People write what I would describe as para-histories or pseudo-histories around it. So some people see it being created for a particular moment in a particular culture, migrating with the Cimbri back to Denmark. And the danger is that one picks the small historical snatches we have and tries to weave them into a story. The story is implausible. For me, the story it tells is that this is some kind of feasting vessel. I think that is fairly clear. It's been heavily used because there's a big hole in the bottom of it. And the hole is covered over. When you go and see it, look into the cauldron and you'll see there's a silver dish in the bottom of it. The dish comes most likely from horse harness. It's a piece that's been added to it later to cover the hole in the bottom. What we don't know is the context in which it was made. But I cannot believe Gundstrup was unique. And there is this difficulty, this danger in archaeology. We take a unique object and we create a unique story, a fairy tale, if you like. Well, we have that fragment from the Romanian hoard, which shows there were other decorated cauldrons out there. Indeed, if you go to Denmark, you will also find other decorated cauldrons. So for me, Gundstrup tells you a much bigger story about connections across Europe in the late Iron Age, and the feasting is a key part of that story, rather than trying to tie it to a particular moment in space and time. So connected into feasting, showing us these wide-ranging connections, but there's then a whole literature trying to interpret what the stories and images mean on it, and I think that's a mug's game. I think it's impossible to tell.
Thank you. I just wanted to raise a point that was touched on in the final film at the end of the exhibition. There's just one fleeting reference to language, but you also referred to language yourself. I would be interested to hear you develop that aspect of Celtic identity. Thanks.
I tried to flag, well, language crops up a couple of times in the exhibition. It crops up when we're able to talk about it, when we get the inscriptions in Ogham in particular, and the Pictish symbols, which my colleague Martin would argue are a form of communication, if not language. And there's an audiovisual dealing with language at that point. And then it's mentioned at the end, because we were very keen. The audiovisual, for those who haven't seen it, the end audiovisual is a series of various folk who work on the idea of Celts, so the two curators, but also some other colleagues, but also other specialists, so some linguists, some other archaeologists and so on, who are all saying effectively different views on what is Celtic, what are Celts. And this idea of difference was very important because we're trying not, if you like, to put a single voice over this thing. You know, we don't have a God-given right to the truth. We're not trying to tell you a truth. We're trying to open your minds to all kinds of possibilities. So we touch on language in those 2 points. We didn't go into language in great detail because it's quite hard to do language in museums. Our stock in trade is objects. You know, objects are what we do best. And I think we can do a really nice job with these artifacts. Languages are better covered somewhere else, in books, in films, in libraries. This is not really the kind of place to do that. So we raise the issue, but don't really deal with it in detail. I do think, though, that it doesn't... My overlapping circles picture, I think, is the one to bear in mind here, because they're not telling us about quite the same thing. Linguistics are really important. The development of language is really important. The way language expresses people's identity is really important, but there cannot have been a single identity linked to these languages over however far back you take them, which on some scholarship would be back 5,000 years. It's clearly not reflecting the same thing, and certainly can't be bundled under a single simple identity as Celtic. So Celtic's a useful modern analytical label to understand languages with, but it has the same problem of the partly overlapping circles. It's not the truth and the whole truth.
Hello. It might be a little bit of a rookie question, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts on the two things coming out of the heads of various figures and why they are leaves.
Good question. They're a very specific thing. I can only, in a talk like this, you can only touch on particular things. I did warn you I could focus on the 3rd century. I could also focus on the 5th century, which is the time that these, what they call leaf crowns, emerge. And some scholars would see these as mistletoe, and have argued that they're tied into some particular significance of mistletoe. Some argue not. What we do know, though, is that they seem to mark out particular individuals as special or sacred in some way, and they're not just imagination. Because the burial which I showed a picture of, the Glauberg burial, this is the burial near Frankfurt, and this is a massive burial mound, and on or near that burial mound was a stone statue. The statue is dressed like a warrior, you saw the picture, and on his head is this leaf crown. We have a cast of the statue in the exhibition. In the same mound, the burial was the burial of the person depicted in the stone. The same jewellery, the same finger ring, the same torque, the same shield, and the iron framing, I think it was, for what must have been a pair of these Mickey Mouse ears. So clearly it was something, a kind of cap or fancy headgear that some people wore. The fact that this was an incredibly rich burial makes you think it would have marked out this person's status as a secular leader, a ritual leader, something like that. So somehow they are marking out some people as special or sacred. Beyond that, it's probably unwise to speculate.
Okay.
A couple of minutes ago, you mentioned Pictish symbols, and I deliberately waited for your talk before going to the exhibition, which we'll do soon, and I was obviously wondering if you're going to include Pictish art. Now, you did show a highly anachronistic drawing of a Pict. Right at the end, where you showed a gallery view, I think there was the Papal Stone, which most people would say is probably Pictish, even though it doesn't contain Pictish symbols. So on the wider question, did you and your colleagues discuss whether you would include Pictish art? In other words, are the Picts Celts, or is that looking at it in much too black and white?
There's a wonderful, for those who haven't seen the exhibition, there's a wonderful line. My colleague Fleming Cowell, who's my opposite number in Denmark, the Iron Age curator in Denmark, he has this wonderful line, which I'm going to crib all the time. He says, "The Celts, they seem to be everywhere, and yet they are nowhere." And I would apply the same thing to thinking about the Picts. Are the Picts Celts? It's impossible to say. What do you mean by Celts? I think in that sense it's a non-question. What I would say is that to understand Pictish art, I think you have to put it into that early medieval context. So clearly, the stuff that we have on display from Norre's Law, for example, is part of this wider early medieval story, coming out of a Roman world and ultimately tying into a Christian world. So Pictish art is absolutely enmeshed in that material. Are the Picts Celts? Somebody else's problem.
Thank you, Fraser, for a fantastic talk. I wanted to ask, what do you think about where we go from here? What are your recommendations for the future, and how do we start to challenge the wider public perception of the Celts?
I think exhibitions like this are one of the key ways of doing it. It was slightly depressing to see the BBC programme, which we were involved in early discussions with, presenting a very traditional battles, blood and burials view of the Celts, driven by the Greek and Roman sources, which, yeah, they're not worthless, but they are biased. So trying to get away from some of those kind of things, avoiding using Celt as an easy explanation, I think is one of the obvious things to do. And trying to show how much more exciting it is to get some of the nitty-gritty details. We can answer big questions with the data that we have. We just have to be bold enough to try it. There's, I think, still also, something like this is a genuinely interdisciplinary study. Now, at the moment, the disciplines don't always fit together that well. But there will undoubtedly be more insights in trying to get the linguists, the archaeologists, the art historians talking together. Then again, we also have to accept our disciplines and our evidence may well be telling us different things about different stories. So there is no requirement to create this single uber model of what the Celts are. For me, I reckon you could go chasing these objects for a long time yet. And this idea of context, of understanding the context, what do they mean? What do they do? What do they compare to? I can see many years of fun chasing these things for a while yet.
Thank you. Mentioning context takes me back to one of the things you said right at the beginning when you showed one of the Iron Age shields and said that this was among the things that were not put up on display and hung up on a wall. But surely those shields are good examples of things that were used principally for display, because no doubt they were carried into battle, but they manifestly weren't actually used in combat because they don't bear the marks of somebody poking at them with an iron spear or slashing at them with an iron sword. So even if they were paraded up and down beforehand, they were taken somewhere safe while the actual fighting was going on. While the Celts weren't fighting, which, as you say, isn't something they weren't doing every day, were these things wrapped up and put under the bed, or were they hung up to be shown? And the point about the context, these things came out of rivers where they were deposited in exactly the same way as Bronze Age shields of a very different kind had been deposited maybe 1,000 years earlier. So the context of a lot of this stuff is very old.
I suppose I was being slightly disingenuous in that, yes, these things are, display is a key part of what these things are for. My contrast is, I suppose, with the idea that we tend to have of art being things you put on the wall and admire. These are objects which could be used in a variety of different contexts. We don't know, of course, were they being displayed when not in use. One possible clue may come from some of the so-called temple treasures that you get from France, where you do get these big finds with a variety of spectacular material. I'm thinking particularly the one from Tantignac, which is a couple of shield components among swords, scabbards, carnases, helmets, and these kind of things. And they seem to have been things that are gathered in the temple or the sanctuary. It may be taken out at particular moments for battle, whether posturing or real. And I think we have to be a little careful about assuming that battle has to involve violence. You know, the threat of violence can be just as effective if you're looking at a single combat heroic warfare, if warfare can be heroic. So being the person with the flashiest sword and the flashiest shield may be enough to win a battle in that sense. But the point you make about the context, or the deposition context, is a really important one. Because, of course, most of this stuff survives because somebody buried it. On the continent, much of that is coming out of individual burials. In Britain and Ireland, most of it's coming out of interesting wet places. And as Brendan says, many of those are exactly the places where you're also seeing Bronze Age metalwork coming out of. Not universally the same, but there are overlaps. And there is this interesting it would be a really interesting long-term study of the kind of places in the landscape that are seen as where you put your valuables, where you sacrifice these important objects. It's striking, for instance, that all these display shields are from the east side of the country. They're all from the Thames or the Witham. There's nothing really anywhere else. And there seem to be patterns, broad-scale patterns in terms of areas that bury things and areas that don't. But this is all getting very archaeological. However, these are stories I think that we can tease out and bring back to a bigger level again, because they help us to understand why those objects are there at all, why they're being buried. So a long-term view would undoubtedly need to go back into the Bronze Age as well.
Okay, I think we have to cut it short there, folks, but thank you very much indeed for your interest, your questions and comments. I was still on the staff of this museum when the idea first emerged of doing an exhibition on the Celts. And I must admit that my initial thought was, oh, the Celts, why are we doing that? Thought they were a bit out of fashion or, a bit passé. what Fraser has given us tonight is a total rebuttal to my rather stupid thoughts, a tour de force, a tremendous erudite trip round so much of our past, our part in Europe. And not only has he given us this lecture, he's opened the way, as it were, to the doors of a fantastic exhibition which you must all go and see again or see several times. So please do and revel in it. A tremendous effort by everybody. But must ask you to thank Fraser for his performance tonight in the usual way.